"Can you cook?" he asked the humiliated orc bride. Her answer changed everything. She left before the sun came up. The house was dark except for the kitchen, where the stove still held heat from last night's fire. Her bag sat by the door, the same bag she had arrived with 3 weeks ago, packed the same way, holding the same things. Nothing added, nothing taken. The children were asleep, the girl in the back room, the boy in the loft. She could hear the girl's breathing through the wall, slow, steady, the particular rhythm of a 6-year-old who sleeps without worry because someone has made the world feel safe enough to sleep in. She had done that. She had made the world safe for a child who was not hers, and now she was leaving it. The man sat at the kitchen table. He had been awake when she came out of her room with the bag. He had not spoken. He sat with a cup in his hands, cold, untouched, and watched her move through the kitchen in the dark, collecting the last of what was hers. She stopped at the door. He did not ask her to stay. He did not stand. He sat at the table with the cold cup and looked at her back and said nothing, because he understood something about this woman that had taken him 3 weeks to learn. She did not leave places she wanted to be. If she was leaving, she had a reason, and the reason was hers, and asking her to set it aside for him would be exactly the kind of thing she was leaving to escape. The door opened. Cold air came in. She stepped through it and pulled the door shut behind her. The latch clicked. The house held its breath. 3 weeks earlier, the market square in Ashenford was not built for ceremonies, but ceremonies happen there anyway, the kind that towns produce when something has been arranged at a distance and requires a public witness to become real. The orc bride arrived on the morning cart from the northern pass. She was the only passenger. Single bag, a dress that had been pressed before the journey and had not survived it, her hands loose at her sides and her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. Her name was Drea. She was 24 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of orc women, her skin a deep green that caught the morning light and held it. Her tusks were short, not filed, just naturally small, which some orc clans considered a deficiency and which Drea had stopped caring about long enough ago that the not caring had become part of her posture. Aldrich Venn was waiting at the far end of the square with a folded paper and the look of a man who had been rehearsing bad news long enough that the rehearsing had made it worse. He had filed the contract 6 months prior with the Border Marriage Agency, the organization that matched orc women from the Northern Territories with human men in the border towns, an arrangement that benefited both sides in theory and neither side in practice, with the consistency that theoretical arrangements tend to produce. Aldrich had spent the 6 months since changing his mind. He had written no letter, because a letter would have required courage he did not have when witnesses were absent. Drea had spent 3 years in the women's hall of her former clan, a place where unmarried orc women without family connections lived and worked, mending clothes, processing hides, waiting for an arrangement that would give them a household. When the solicitation came, she read it twice, signed her name, and spent the last coin she had on the cart, fare south. Aldrich stepped forward when she reached the bottom of the square. He held the contract papers the way a man holds something he wants to be rid of, at arm's length, the corners crumpling under his grip. "I can't go through with it," he said. He said it loud enough to carry which was the whole of the cruelty, because the square was not empty. The baker's wife was there, and the farrier's apprentice, and 3 women from the wash house, and an old man on the bench outside the feed store who had been watching the square since dawn, because watching the square was what he did. By midday, half the town would know. By evening, the rest would. Drea stood and let him finish, hands at her sides, her face doing what she needed it to do, which was nothing. Stillness, the blankness of a woman who would not give a public audience the satisfaction of watching her break. "I signed the papers in good faith," Aldrich continued, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who is performing regret while feeling relief. "But I've thought about it, and I don't think, an orc wife, I don't think it would work for either of us." He held the contract up once. Not a deed. Everyone in that square knew a woman was not land. But he held it like a man who wanted the weight of paper behind him. Then he put the papers back in his coat and walked away without looking back. The square cleared around her, not quickly, slowly, the way water drains from a shallow basin, leaving the thing at the bottom exposed. Drea remained. bag at her feet, the town spread out in front of her, and no clear answer to what came next. She had no money for the cart back. She had no family to return to. The women's hall would take her back, but the journey was 3 days on foot through the pass in weather that was turning toward winter. And arriving back at the hall with an unused contract and no husband was a particular kind of failure that the hall would process into a permanent category. She was standing on a square in a town that did not want her, with a bag she could not carry far enough to matter, and the morning was getting older around her. Across the square, a man came down the steps of the trading post with a paper bag of nails and stopped on the boardwalk. 31 years old, broad in the shoulders but not tall, hands that had worked, scarred across the knuckles, calloused at the palms, the hands of a man who built things or fixed things or both. He had sawdust on his sleeve from the morning, and the look of a man who had carried too much for too long, long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. He stood on the step and read the square, the bag, the straight back, the empty space where a man had just been. The orc woman standing in it. Then he crossed the square. He stopped at the bottom of the steps where Drea stood and looked up at her. Not with pity. She would have seen pity and turned away from it. Not with calculation. She would have seen that too. With something simpler. The plain, unhurried attention of a man assessing a situation and deciding whether he had anything useful to offer it. Corin Ashward, he said, I've got 2 children and a house that needs keeping. I do repair work in town. 3 days a week, mornings. You'd have the place to yourself. He held her gaze. His eyes were brown, steady, tired in the way that grief makes people tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of continuing. It's temporary, he said. Room and board until you've sorted what's next. Took the measure of him the way she had learned to take the measure of everything. Quickly, because the world did not give orc women long to decide. Can you cook? He said. She met his eyes. I can, and I'm not afraid of hard work. She picked up her bag. Then let's go, she said. They walked off the square together, and behind them the town watched and stored it up for later. The house sat at the edge of Ashenford, where the last buildings thinned and the tree line began. A single-story structure with log walls and a stone chimney that was producing smoke, which meant someone had banked the fire before leaving that morning. The habit of a man who expected to come home to a cold house and had made peace with it, but still prepared against it. A horse stood in the side pen, watching them approach with the mild interest of an animal that had opinions about strangers, but kept them private. The porch had a step that sagged under weight, the kind of repair a man notices every day and never gets to, because the list of things that need repairing is longer than the hours available. Drea noted the step without comment. She noted the horse, the chimney, the woodpile that was adequate but not generous, the garden plot along the south wall that had been planted at some point and abandoned at another. She noted these things the way she noted everything, not as judgments but as information. The inventory of a woman who had learned that understanding a place quickly was the difference between surviving in it and being consumed by it. Inside, the front room was clean in the way of a house managed by a man alone. Functional, orderly, with nothing soft in it. No curtains, no cushions, no flowers, dried or otherwise. A workbench along the far wall with tools arranged by size. A stove doing its steady work in the corner, throwing heat into a room that absorbed it without warmth. On the shelf above the kitchen window sat a small wooden box with a carved lid. It had the look of something no one had touched in a long time. Dust settled into the carving, the wood dried from years of neglect. Something everyone in the house had quietly agreed to leave alone. Room off the kitchen is yours, Corin said. Your own door, your own space. Children eat at 6. I eat when I get back. He said this the way he said everything. Plainly, without decoration, the sentences of a man who had learned that extra words were a luxury he could not afford, because the children needed facts, and facts did not require flourish. The boy came from the rear of the house with the timing of a child who had been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Tam, 10 years old, his father's build already showing in the shoulders, a face that kept its own counsel. He looked at Drea the way a person looks at something they have seen a version of before, and are not ready to feel differently about. He had seen women come into this house before, 2 of them since his mother died, and he had watched both of them leave, and the watching had taught him that the leaving was the part you could count on. He looked at his father. Then he turned and went back the way he came, without a word, which said plenty. Lyra did not make an entrance, so much as she materialized. 6 years old. Hair that had been braided by someone who was trying but did not have the practice. One side tight, the other already unraveling. She stood near the bedroom doorway with the full and unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. She looked at Drea with her whole face, not afraid. Children that age were not afraid of orc women the way adults were, because children had not yet absorbed the stories that made the fear make sense. She looked at Drea the way she looked at everything, completely, without reservation, with the total commitment of a person who had 6 years of experience and intended to use all of it. Drea looked back, steady and even. Nothing performed. "Are you hungry?" Drea said. Lyra considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "A little bit." "Come help me find what's in the larder." Supper that first night was beans and root vegetables, and a broth that had no business smelling the way it did, given what the larder held. Drea had opened every container, every jar, every sack in the kitchen. The inventory was sparse. Dried beans, salt, flour, a handful of root vegetables going soft, rendered fat, and a collection of seasonings that had been purchased at some point by someone who knew what they were for and had not been touched since. The seasonings were the dead wife's. Drea understood this without being told. They were arranged in a particular order on a particular shelf, and the dust on them matched the dust on the carved box above the window, and both had the quality of things preserved not by use, but by grief. She used them anyway. Not all of them. 3. The ones she recognized from orc cooking, a bark spice, a dried herb, a ground root that her mother had used in stews. She added them to the broth with the particular confidence of a woman who had been cooking since she was old enough to reach the pot, and who understood that food was not about ingredients, but about the decision to make something worth eating out of whatever was available. From her own bag she took 2 things, a small pouch of dried peppers from the Northern Territories, and a twist of smoked salt that orc women carried the way human women carried handkerchiefs. She added both. The smell reached the front room before anyone sat down. Corin came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face, quick, involuntary. The particular expression of a man who has not smelled home cooking in long enough that the smell itself is a blow. He set it aside, filled it wherever he filed the things he could not afford to feel during operating hours. They sat. Tam ate quietly, his eyes on his bowl, performing disinterest. Lyra ate with her gaze moving between her bowl and Drea in steady rotation, the metronome of a child cataloging a new person. Partway through the meal, Lyra set her spoon down and said, with the devastating matter-of-factness of a 6-year-old, that the last woman who kept house for them had burned everything she touched. "Lyra," Corin said. The single word carried warning and weariness in equal measure. Lyra looked at Drea instead. "Burnt beans are a serious matter," Drea said, eyes on her plate. "I don't take them lightly." The corner of his mouth moved once, a micro-expression, there and gone, and returned to where it had been. He said nothing more. But when supper was finished, he stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to before going to bed. Corin noted this without comment. He cleared the bowls. Drea washed them. They moved around each other in the small kitchen, with the careful choreography of 2 people learning how much space the other one took up. "The broth was good," Corin said, not looking at her. "The seasonings helped. They were well chosen." A silence, the particular silence that happens when a dead woman's things have been used by a living one, and both people in the room know it, and neither is ready to discuss what it means. "She knew her spices," Corin said. "Yes," Drea said. "She did." He went to the porch. She went to her room. The house settled into the quiet of a first night. Not comfortable, not hostile, but the careful neutrality of a space that is waiting to see what kind of place it will become. The following morning, Corin came off the porch and the sagging step held solid under his boot. He stopped, pressed it again, looked down at the board, which had been shimmed and re-nailed sometime between midnight and dawn, with a precision that suggested the person who had done it knew what they were doing. He went inside and poured 2 cups from the pot Drea had already made, left one on the counter near where she was working. Nothing said about the step. She said nothing about it either. They drank in the early quiet, and the cold morning settled in around the house. The days found their rhythm, not comfortably. Comfort was too strong a word for what was happening, but functionally, the way a machine finds its running speed, each part doing its work, not yet smooth, but moving. Drea cleaned. She cooked. She repaired things that needed repairing with a competence that surprised no one who had watched her fix the step, but that Corin noted the way he noted all things, quietly, thoroughly, without comment. She washed the children's clothes and mended the boy's shirt where the elbow had worn through, using a stitch her mother had taught her. Tight, nearly invisible. Tam wore the shirt the next day and did not mention the repair, which was his version of approval. She reorganized the larder, moved the flour to where it could be reached without climbing, put the salt where light wouldn't reach it, shifted the rendered fat to the cool side. Small changes, each one practical, none of them asking permission. On the second morning, she found the garden plot along the south wall and spent an hour clearing it. The soil underneath was good, dark, fertile, the kind that held water. Someone had planted here with knowledge and intention. The rows were spaced for companion planting, the layout designed to maximize sun exposure. A healer's garden, Drea thought, or a cook's. Someone who understood that what grew in the ground would end up on the table, and who had planned accordingly. She did not plant anything. It was not her garden. But she cleared it, and the clearing was its own kind of statement, a space made ready for something that had not yet been decided. On the third morning, Lyra followed her from room to room, not helping, watching. The focused surveillance of a child who has identified the most interesting person in the house and intends to study them. "What are you making?" Lyra asked, standing on tiptoe to see the counter. "Bread. Can I help? Can you reach the flour?" "If I stand on the stool, then stand on the stool." Lyra dragged the stool across the kitchen floor with the maximum amount of noise a 6-year-old can produce from a wooden object on a wooden floor, climbed it, and stood at the counter with the concentrated seriousness of a field general assuming command. Drea gave her a lump of dough and showed her how to knead it. Press, fold, turn. Lyra's small hands worked the dough with more force than finesse, which was exactly right for bread and for 6-year-olds. "My mama used to make bread," Lyra said. Drea kept kneading. "Was she good at it?" "The best. Papa says so. Tam doesn't talk about it. People remember differently. Some talk, some don't." Lyra considered this. "I talk. I noticed. Is that bad? No. Talking is how some people keep things alive." Lyra looked at her dough, then at Drea. "Are you going to stay?" Drea's hands paused on the dough. One beat. Then she resumed. "I'm here now," she said. "Let's finish the bread." It was not an answer, and Lyra knew it, but she accepted it the way children accept things that are true without being complete, with the faith that the rest would come later. On the fourth evening, Corin came home and the house smelled different, not just food, the house itself. Drea had opened windows during the day, had scrubbed the floors with water and vinegar, had beaten the dust out of the bedding and hung it in the sun. The house smelled clean in a way it had not smelled in 3 years, the particular freshness of a space that has been attended to by someone who understands that a house is not just walls and a roof, but an environment, and that environments require maintenance. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the same doorway, the same house, but the air was different, and the light fell differently on surfaces that were clean. And Corin understood, without being told, without needing to be told, that what Drea was doing was not housework. It was the slow, methodical process of a woman transforming a space she occupied into a space she inhabited. The difference between those two things was the difference between sleeping in a room and living in one. He took his boots off at the door. He had not done that before. had tracked dirt in for years because tracking dirt was what you did when you had stopped caring about the floor. Today he took his boots off and set them beside the door and went inside in his socks. Drea noticed. She did not comment. She set his plate on the table and went back to the stove. On the 5th evening after supper, Drea read to Lyra from a book of stories she had found on the shelf, a children's book with worn pages and a cracked spine, the kind of book that had been read hundreds of times by someone who was gone. She did the voices without embarrassment. The villain growled. The princess spoke in a high, reedy tone that made Lyra giggle. The hero talked like Corin, flat, plain, saying only what was necessary. Lyra pressed against Drea's side with the complete trust of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. Tam sat at the far end of the room. He did not look up. He did not leave. Corin sat at the table with a cup. He watched the fire, but he was listening to the voices. His wife's book read by another woman's mouth, filling the room with sounds that had been absent for 3 years. He held the cup with both hands and did not drink and did not move and did not look away from the fire because looking at what was happening on the other side of the room would have required acknowledging that it was happening, and he was not ready for that. Not yet. But soon. On the 10th day, Aldrich Venn came back to Ashenford. Drea heard about it from the baker's wife, who mentioned it at the trading post with the careful casualness of a woman delivering important information while pretending not to. That man who was supposed to marry you, the baker's wife said, adjusting a sack of flour she did not need to adjust. He's taken a room at the boarding house. He's been asking about you, about the Ashford place, about the children. Thank you for telling me, Drea said. I just thought you should know. I know. Her face showed nothing. The same face she had worn on the square, the same controlled stillness. But her hands, which hung at her sides, had curled slightly inward, the fingers pressing against the palms. Not fists, just pressure. The body's way of holding something the face would not show. She had expected this, not hoped for it, not feared it, expected it, the way you expect weather. Aldrich Venn was the kind of man who regretted only when someone else benefited from his decision. He had rejected her because she was an orc woman, and the rejection had cost him nothing. Now, the rejection had produced something. A woman in another man's house. Children who were cared for. A household that functioned, and the something was more valuable than the nothing he had chosen. And Aldrich was the kind of man who could not tolerate watching someone else profit from his discard. She did not tell Corin that evening. She cooked. She ate with the children. She washed the bowls. She went to her room and sat on the bed and thought about a square in a town where a man had held up a contract and said he couldn't go through with it, and about the particular quality of silence that follows when a woman decides not to fall apart. She thought about leaving. The thought came naturally. It was the thought she had been having since she arrived, the background hum of a woman who had been in enough temporary places to know that temporary was what she was. She had been temporary at the women's hall, temporary on the cart, temporary on the square, temporary in this house, in this room, at this table, the word Corin had used. Temporary, room and board, until you've sorted what's next. She had not sorted what was next. She had sorted the larder instead, and the children's clothes, and the sagging step, and the daily rhythm of a house that needed her. And she had been so busy sorting the immediate that the next had remained unsorted, sitting in the corner of her mind, like her bag, sat in the corner of her room. Packed, ready, waiting. Over the next 3 days, she felt Aldrich's presence in the town the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not visible, not audible, but present in the way people looked at her at the trading post. In the way, conversations paused when she entered a room and resumed at a different pitch when she left it. He was somewhere in Ashenford, asking questions, and the questions were traveling through the town ahead of him like ripples ahead of a stone. On the 11th day, she saw him, across the square. He was coming out of the boarding house, and she was carrying water from the pump, and their eyes met for 3 seconds across the distance of a town square that was the same square where he had rejected her 13 days earlier. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. She broke the gaze first, not from weakness, firm decision. She was not going to conduct this conversation at a distance, across a public square, for the entertainment of whoever happened to be watching. She carried the water home, set it on the counter, stood at the window for a moment, looking at the yard, the tree line, the sky. Then she started supper. On the 12th day, Tam tested her. Not the way the first test had gone, the quiet structural test of a boy seeing whether an adult would hold a line. This was different. This was personal. They were at the table after supper. Lyra had gone to bed. Corin was on the porch. Tam sat across from Drea, with his plate pushed away and his arms crossed, and the expression of a 10-year-old who has decided to ask the question he's been carrying for 12 days. "The man who was supposed to marry you," he said, "he's in town." Drea looked at him. "I know. Are you scared of him?" "No." "Then why haven't you told my father?" The question was sharp, not cruel, precise. The precision of a child who had learned to watch adults carefully and had noticed that this particular adult was carrying a secret, and who understood, at 10, that secrets in a house were dangerous because they were the things that made people leave. "Because it's not your father's problem," Drea said. "You live in his house. I keep his house. There's a difference." Tam looked at her. The assessment was quick and thorough, the same assessment his father had performed on the square, the same steady evaluation of a person who reads others by watching rather than asking. He had inherited this from Corin the way he had inherited the shoulders and the silence. "If he comes here," Tam said, "what will you do?" "I'll handle it." "How?" "That depends on what he wants. What if he wants you to go with him? Then I'll tell him no. What if he doesn't listen, carrying the weight of a dead mother and 2 failed housekeepers and the particular fear of a child who has begun to feel safe and knows that safety is the thing that gets taken away?" "Tam," she said, "I came to this house because I had nowhere else to go. I'm staying because I choose to. If that man or any other man tries to make that choice for me, he'll learn something about Orc women that the Border Marriage Agency doesn't put in their contracts." Then something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not a softening, but the release of tension. The particular relaxation of a boy who has been bracing for an answer and received one that he can live with. "Okay," he said. He got up and went to the loft. At the bottom of the ladder, he stopped. "The bread you made today," he said, without turning around. "It was almost as good as my mother's." He climbed the ladder. Drea sat at the table and heard the compliment, for what it was, not almost a compliment, the highest one he had. The confrontation came on the 14th day. Drea was walking back from the trading post with a sack of flour over one shoulder when Aldrich Venn stepped into the road. He looked different from the square, or rather, he looked the same but arranged differently. The same clothes, the same face, but the posture of a man who had spent 2 weeks listening to a town talk about the woman he had rejected, and had heard things that rearranged his understanding of what he had given up. He had heard about the cooking, about the children, about the boy who stayed at the table and the girl who followed the Orc woman from room to room, about the house that looked different. Smoke at the right hours, garden plot cleared, the sagging step fixed. About Corin Ashwood's face when he came home in the evenings, which was not the face of a man coming home to an empty house anymore. Aldrich had heard all of this, and it had settled into his pride like a stone in a boot, present, irritating, impossible to ignore. "The contract is still valid," he said. He held the papers up. The fare was paid. The arrangement was binding. Drea set the flour down. She looked at Aldrich Venn the way she had looked at him on the square, straight, level, her face doing what she needed it to do. But this time was different. This time there was something behind the stillness that had not been there before. Not anger. Anger was reactive. And Drea was not reacting. She was deciding. "You rejected me," she said. Her voice was even. "In front of the entire town. You held those papers up and said you couldn't go through with it. You said an Orc wife wouldn't work for either of us. I was hasty. I've reconsidered." "You reconsidered because you heard I can cook." Aldrich's face shifted, the particular discomfort of a man whose motives have been accurately identified. The contract was for a marriage. You refused the marriage, in public, with witnesses. The contract ended when you walked away from it. That's not how the law... I don't care how the law works, Aldrich. She said his name the way you set down something heavy, deliberately, with the intention of not picking it up again. You looked at me on that square and decided I wasn't worth the life you'd planned. That was your choice. You made it. It's done. She picked up the flower, put it back on her shoulder. I'm not yours. I was never yours. A contract doesn't make a person property, and changing your mind doesn't undo what you did in front of this whole town. She turned and walked away. Aldrich stood in the road, the papers in his hand. The town around him, because the town was always around, always watching, always storing things up for later. He called after her, "You're living in another man's house. You think that's better? You think?" "I think it's none of your concern," said a voice from behind him. Corin Ashwood stood on the boardwalk. He had come out of the trading post behind Drea and had been standing there long enough to hear all of it. He had not interrupted. He had not stepped between them. He had waited because the woman was speaking for herself, and she was doing it well, and inserting himself into the middle of it would have been exactly the kind of thing she didn't need. But now she had finished, and she was walking away and Aldrich was still talking, and that part Corin was willing to address. "She gave you her answer," Corin said. "It was clear. Go." Looked at the papers, looked at the road where Drea was walking away without looking back. The same posture as the square, straight back, chin level, but different now. On the square, she had been enduring. Now she was deciding. Aldrich put the papers in his coat. He walked to his horse. He rode out of Ashenford, and the cold morning closed behind him. The town talked. The town always talked. They talked about the orc woman who had stood in the road and told the man with the contract that she wasn't his. They talked about how she had said it, calm, final, without raising her voice. They talked about what it meant, whether an orc woman could refuse a contract, whether a contract meant anything if the man had already broken it, whether the whole arrangement was proper in the first place. They talked about Corin Ashwood standing on the boardwalk, not stepping in, not stepping forward, until the woman had finished speaking. They talked about what that meant, too, whether he was weak for not defending her sooner, or smart for letting her defend herself, or something else entirely that didn't fit the categories the town usually used. A woman from the wash house, Petra Gesser, who had opinions about everything and shared them with the generosity of a person who considers silence a personal failure, found Drea at the trading post 2 days later. "People are talking," Petra said, with the warm concern of a woman delivering a message she had prepared at home. "About you living in Ashwood's house, about the children, about what kind of example it sets." Drea set her coins on the counter one at a time. "You're an orc woman in a human man's house with human children," Petra continued. "People have ideas about what that means. People have ideas about everything," Drea said. "It doesn't make them right. I'm just saying, for your own sake, appearances matter." 24 years old, and she had been assessed by women with prepared voices in enough rooms that she had built a durable patience for it. The patience of a woman who knew that another person's measure of her was not the truth. "Thank you for your concern," she said, and walked out. She stood at the kitchen window that evening with her hands on the sill and looked at the yard and the tree line beyond it, and the cold, flat sky. She stood there longer than she needed to. Then she started supper. Corin was at the stove and she was finishing the dishes, and without looking up from the fire, he said, "You all right?" She kept her hands in the basin. Thought about it, honestly. About Aldrich, about Petra, about the town and its opinions, and the particular weight of being visible in a place that preferred you invisible. "I am," she said. He nodded once at the fire. She went back to the dishes. The room held its quiet around them both. The moment came on a gray morning without announcement. Lyra was moving through the kitchen in her socks, still warm from sleep, absorbed in a private conversation with a rag doll that apparently required significant diplomatic attention. She caught her foot on the threshold between the kitchen and the hall and went down hard on both palms. The sound she made was the startled kind, the sound that comes before a child has decided whether this warrants tears. She decided it did. Drea was on the floor with her before the crying had fully started. took both small hands in hers and looked at the palms, scraped, red, no blood, and held them warm and steady, not making a fuss, not going anywhere. The calm, practiced response of a woman who had been around children long enough to know that the holding mattered more than the fixing. And Lyra, without meaning to say anything at all, said the word that was simply true. Mama. No more. And then she gathered the girl in and held her until the crying ran itself out, calm and certain, and giving no outward sign of what the word had done to the room. Corin was in the bedroom doorway. He had heard it. He stood with one hand on the frame and looked at the hallway floor without moving. Something was happening in him. Something that had been shut for 3 years was working toward open, and he kept his eyes away from it, because some things change the moment you look at them straight. At the table, Tam had gone still, 10 years old. He knew exactly what he had heard and exactly what it meant. His face did the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks. The slow, reluctant work of a boy who is allowing himself to feel something he swore he wouldn't feel again. Corin went back into his room and sat on the edge of the bed, with his hand flat on his knee, and stayed there while the morning moved quietly around the house. That night, Drea lay in the dark of her room and did not sleep. Mama. The word sat in her chest like something with weight and edges, a word a child had said without thinking. The most honest kind of word, the kind that comes from the place beneath strategy and self-protection, from the place where a 6-year-old simply says what is true, and it was true. Drea knew it. She had felt it forming for days, in the bread-making, in the mending, in the way Lyra's hand found hers when they walked to the trading post, in the way Tam had started looking at her not as a stranger, but as a fact of the house, something that belonged in it, the way the stove belonged, or the table. She had become part of this family, not officially, not by contract or ceremony, but by the slow accumulation of presence. Meals cooked, clothes mended, steps fixed, mornings shared, evenings quiet. The daily work of showing up and being useful and not leaving. And that was the problem. She had not chosen this. She had been placed here by Aldrich's rejection, by Corin's offer, by circumstance. Every act of belonging she had performed in this house had been an act of survival first, and something else second. She had cooked because it was the arrangement. She had cleaned because it was expected. She had tended the children because they needed tending, and she was the one available to tend them. But Mama was not an arrangement. Mama was a claim, a child's claim on a woman's heart, and it deserved to be answered by a woman who was there by choice, not by the absence of alternatives. She thought about the women's hall where she had grown up, the dormitory with the narrow beds, the mending room where she had spent 3 years waiting for an arrangement, the older women who had been there long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of life. She had told herself she would never go back, that whatever was ahead, whatever town, whatever arrangement, it would be better than the hall. But better than the hall was not the same as chosen. Better than the hall was just less bad. And Drea was tired of measuring her life against the worst version of it. Tired of grateful. Grateful for a room. Grateful for an arrangement. Grateful for a man who didn't reject her. Grateful was the posture of a woman who expected nothing and was surprised by anything above nothing. She wanted more than grateful. She wanted to walk into a house because it was hers, not because it was available. She wanted to hold a child and know that the holding was a gift she gave freely, not a service she provided in exchange for a roof. She thought about Corin, the man who left coffee on the counter without comment, who asked, "You all right?" without looking up from the fire, who had stood on the boardwalk and let her speak for herself, and stepped in only when she was finished. He was a good man, a decent man, the kind of man who carried the weight of a dead wife and 2 children, and a house, and a job, and never complained about any of it because complaining was a luxury, and he could not afford luxuries. She liked him. She might, given time and circumstance, feel more than that. But liking was not the same as choosing, and feeling was not the same as deciding. And she could not build a life on the gratitude of a woman who had nowhere else to go and the decency of a man who had given her somewhere. She thought about Aldrich in the road, about the contract he had waived, about the word his and the way it had landed on the street, like something thrown. Aldrich had treated her as property. Corin had treated her as a person. But both of them had made choices about her life without asking her to make her own. Corin's choice had been kind. Aldrich's had been cruel. But both had been made for her, and she was finished with that. She packed her bag in the dark, the same bag, the same things. Nothing added, nothing taken. She would leave in the morning. The house, after Drea left, was a house that had forgotten how to work. Not immediately. The first morning was just quiet. Corin made breakfast. It was adequate. The eggs were cooked. The bread was yesterday's. The coffee was coffee, but the kitchen was wrong. Not dirty. Drea had left it clean. Wrong in the way that a room is wrong when the person who organized it is gone, and the organization remains as a ghost of their presence. The flour was where Drea had put it. The salt was where Drea had moved it. The rendered fat was on the cool side because Drea had shifted it there, and Corin reached for it in its old location 3 times before his hand learned the new one. Lyra came out of her room, looked at the kitchen, looked at the table. 2 bowls, not 3. "Where is she?" Lyra said. Corin set a bowl in front of her. "She had to go." "Go where?" "I don't know." "When is she coming back?" Corin looked at his daughter. 6 years old, 1 braid tight, 1 unraveling, because he had tried to do them the way Drea did, and his hands did not have the knowledge. "I don't know," he said. Lyra ate her breakfast. She did not cry. She ate with the focused silence of a child processing information that does not fit and will require time to integrate. Tam did not come down from the loft for breakfast. When Corin called up, Tam's voice came back flat and hard. Not hungry. The house moved through its day. Corin went to work. Lyra went to the neighbors. Tam stayed in the loft, which was his version of saying everything he could not say out loud. That evening, supper was bread and cheese. The stove sat cold. The kitchen smelled like nothing. The second day was worse. Corin attempted the bean stew Drea had made, the one that had smelled good enough to stop him in the doorway on the first night. He used the same pot, the same beans, the same water. He even found the seasonings, the dead wife's spices on the shelf, the ones Drea had used, without asking and without apology. He stood at the stove with a spoon in his hand and the 3 jars in front of him, and realized he did not know how much of each to use. Drea had measured by instinct, the practiced hand of a woman who had been cooking since childhood, and whose fingers knew quantities the way a carpenter's fingers knew distances. Corin's fingers knew wood. They did not know bark spice. The stew was edible. It was not good. Lyra ate it without comment. Tam ate half and pushed the bowl away. "It's not the same," Lyra said quietly. "No," Corin said. "It's not." On the 3rd day, Lyra stopped asking when Drea was coming back. She stopped asking because she had asked 7 times, and the answer had not changed. And 6-year-olds are not stupid. They understand repetition. And they understand when an adult's "I don't know" means "I don't know," and not "soon." She carried her rag doll from room to room in the particular way that children carry comfort objects when the comfort they actually need is not available. She held it tighter than usual. She talked to it more. She told it things that she would have told Drea, and the doll listened the way dolls do, completely and without judgment and without being able to do anything about it. Tam's anger settled into something colder. He came down from the loft for meals but sat at the table in silence, not the productive silence of a boy who is present, but the sealed silence of a boy who has closed the door that was opening and intends to keep it closed. On the 3rd night he came down from the loft. He stood in the kitchen where Corin was sitting at the table with a cup he wasn't drinking. "Bring her back," Tam said. The boy's face was tight, not angry, fighting something harder than anger. The expression of a child who has allowed himself to care about someone and has been rewarded with their absence, and who is trying very hard not to learn the lesson the absence is teaching. "I can't," Corin said. "Why not?" That was her choice. "Then go find her and ask her to come back. She knows where we are, Tam. If she wants to come back, she will." "What if she doesn't?" Corin was quiet for a long time. The stove was cold. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the steady patience of something that would be there long after the people inside the house had resolved whatever they were resolving. "Then we'll be all right," he said. "We were all right before." "We weren't all right before." Tam's voice cracked. Not dramatically, not the way voices crack in stories. The small, private crack of a boy whose throat is tighter than he wants it to be. The house was cold, and the food was bad, and Lyra didn't laugh, and you went to bed before it was dark because there was nothing worth staying up for. That's not all right. That's just surviving. Corin looked at his son and saw the truth of it. Saw it the way you see something you've known for a long time but have never had said to you by a 10-year-old, whose voice is breaking on the words. "You're right," Corin said. "That's not all right." "Then why didn't you stop her?" "Because stopping her would have been the same thing Aldrich did. Making a choice for her. Deciding she belonged to me instead of to herself. She made the bread. Lyra called her mama. She belongs here. She belongs where she chooses to belong, Tam. Not where we put her." The anger fought with the understanding. Anger because the understanding was painful. Understanding because the anger was unfair. And neither won. He went back up the ladder with both of them sitting in his chest, unresolved and heavy and exactly the kind of weight that 10-year-old boys should not have to carry, but sometimes do. Corin sat at the table. The cup was cold. The house was quiet in the particular way that a house is quiet when the person who made it noisy is gone, and everyone remaining is listening for a sound that does not come. She came back on the 7th day, morning, early. The light was thin and gray, and the air had the bite of a season turning. Corin was on the porch. He had taken to sitting there in the mornings, in the spot where the step had been fixed, because the step was the last thing her hands had touched that he could sit on. He had not been waiting for her. He had been sitting there because sitting inside was harder. Inside, the kitchen organized itself around her absence, every jar and shelf a reminder of the order she had imposed, and he could not replicate. Outside, the porch was just a porch. It held no memory except the step, and the step held only the evidence of competent repair. She came up the road from the direction of the northern pass, walking the bag on her shoulder, the same bag. Her dress was different, not the one she had arrived in, not the one she had worn in the house. A different dress, plain, clean. She had been somewhere. She had done something. The somewhere and the something were hers, and she did not owe them to anyone. She stopped at the gate. Corin stood up from the step. They looked at each other across the yard, the distance of 20 feet and 3 weeks and a word that a child had said on a gray morning, and a door that had opened and closed and might now open again. "I left because I needed to," Drea said. "I came here with nothing and no choice. Everything I did in this house, the cooking, the cleaning, the children, I did because it was the arrangement. Because I had nowhere else to go. I went back to the pass, to the women's hall. I told them I was done with arrangements, done with contracts, done with being placed in houses like furniture." She paused. "They offered me a position, cooking for the hall, room, board, wages, a real job, my choice." Corin listened. His face did the thing it always did, gave nothing away, held everything inside. Let the silence carry what words could not. "I turned it down," Drea said, "because I don't want a position. I want a home, and this is the only place that's felt like one." She looked at him across the yard, straight back, chin level, but her eyes were different from the square, not the eyes of a woman enduring, the eyes of a woman who has walked away from something and come back to it, and knows the difference between arriving and returning. "I'm not here because I have to be," she said. "I'm here because I want to be. If you'll have me." Corin stood on the porch. The step that she had fixed held solid under his feet. The house behind him held the cold quiet of a place that had been waiting, not patiently, not impatiently, just waiting the way houses wait. Without judgment, he stepped to the side. The door was behind him. He left it open. No word, no speech, no declaration, just a man moving aside and a door standing open, and the space between them saying everything that needed to be said. Drea picked up her bag, walked across the yard, up the steps, past him, through the door. Inside, the kitchen was cold. The stove unlit, the bowls in the wrong places. Corin had tried to put them back and had gotten the order wrong because the order had been hers and he had not learned it well enough to replicate it. She set her bag down, not in the corner this time, by the stove. A sound from the hallway. Small feet on wood. Lyra appeared in the doorway, hair unbrushed, eyes wide, the rag doll dangling from one hand. She looked at Drea, did not run, did not shout, stood in the doorway with the full weight of a 6-year-old's judgment and assessed the situation. "You came back," Lyra said. "I came back. Are you staying?" "I'm staying." Eye level. Green face to small face. "I promise." Then Lyra moved, fast, the way children move when they have been holding still for too long, and hit Drea's chest with the full body impact of a 6-year-old who has decided that this person is hers and does not intend to renegotiate. Drea held her tight, the way you hold something you left and came back for, and will not put down again. From the loft, the creak of the ladder. Tam appeared at the top. He did not come down. He looked at Drea holding his sister. His face was working, the 10-year-old machinery of a boy who wants to feel something and is afraid of what the feeling will cost. He looked at Drea. She looked up at him. She did not say anything, did not need to. Her being there was the answer to the question he had asked his father 3 nights ago. Tam nodded once, the nod of a boy who has received information he needed and is not ready to discuss it. He went back into the loft, but he left the hatch open, which said plenty. Corin stood in the doorway. The morning light came through the window behind him, catching the dust in the air, the way light does in houses that are about to change. He looked at Drea on the floor with his daughter in her arms and his son's hatch open above, and the bag by the stove and the cold kitchen that would be warm again within the hour. He did not say welcome back. He did not say I missed you. He said what was true and what was needed and what was enough. "I'll light the stove," he said, and the house, which had been holding its breath for 7 days, let it out. The stove caught on the second try. The wood had been laid. Corin had laid it every morning, out of habit, even though no one had cooked on it since she left. The habit of a man who kept the house ready for a return he could not guarantee, but refused to stop preparing for. The coffee was strong. Drea made it the way she had made it every morning. 2 cups, one left on the counter near where Corin was standing. He picked it up, drank it, said nothing about the coffee. She said nothing about the week. They stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, and the cold settled in around the house. And it was enough. Evening weeks later, the smell of something with honey and dried fruit. A new thing Drea was working out, adjusting as she went. The kind of smell that gets into the walls of a kitchen and stays there for years. The door opened, cold air and then Corin's boots on the step that had not sagged since the first night, and would not sag again. The sound of a man who knows his coming home is expected and has stopped taking that for granted. Lyra raised the rag doll briefly in his direction by way of greeting and returned to her negotiations. Tam looked up from the table where he was reading something, looked at his father, then at Drea, at the stove, then back at the book. The looking carried something in it that had not been there at the start of things. Corin hung his coat, crossed to the stove, stood beside Drea. She moved the spoon toward him without a word. He tasted it, considered it quietly. Then he looked at her. She took the spoon back. "I know," she said. "More honey." The corner of his mouth moved. On the shelf above the window, the carved wooden box sat where it had always sat. The dust had been cleaned from it. Not by Corin, not by the children, by Drea, who had wiped it carefully one morning with a cloth, not moving it from its place, not opening it, just cleaning the surface so the carving showed. Beside it, the pouch of dried peppers from the Northern Territories. Drea's, placed on the same shelf, next to the box, not replacing it, not competing with it. 2 women's things, side by side. The late light came through the glass and found them both, and rested there, warm and still. Outside, wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property. The horse shifted in the pen. From somewhere past the tree line, a bird called once, long and unhurried. The house held its warmth, not waiting for anyone. Not anymore. And the woman at the stove, the one who had arrived with nothing but a bag and a spine, who had been rejected on a square and taken in by a stranger and called mama by a child and tested by a boy, and judged by a town and claimed by a man with a contract and had refused all of it, until she could choose it, stood in a kitchen that smelled like home and knew that she had chosen right. Not because the house was warm, not because the man beside her was good, because she had left and she had come back, and the coming back was hers.